Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Great to see you all, and welcome to a traditional IRES webinar that we have on Tuesdays. Today we are going to talk about photographic realism in the context of documentary photography education in Russia and Sweden. My name is Katerina Boyko, and I will be a host of this session. I'm delighted to greet our colleagues from Södertörn University, Patrick Åker and Ludmila Voronova. So Patrick is Associate Professor in Media and Communication Studies at Södertörn, and his research interests include visual communication, journalism, historical perspectives on media, and cultural assumptions about media technologies. And he's currently heading the project Photographic Realism in the Digital Media Age. Ludmila is a senior lecturer in journalism at Södertörn, and she focuses on comparative studies of journalism's cultures, conflict and media, gender and intersectionality, and media and migration. Ludmila is also involved in this project. So I think that today we are going to work in a bit unconventional way. Patrick and Ludmila will present their project, and I am starting to collect your questions in chat immediately. And somewhere in between, we will make some pauses and ask them these questions. So we will have 1 or 2 pauses during the presentation for questions. And then in the end, we will have a bigger Q&A session. So now I'm giving the word to Patrick, and you're welcome.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for inviting us to this seminar and have the opportunity to talk about our project. And I must first say maybe that we haven't really written something yet. So this is really work in progress. So we will talk about some preliminary findings and so on, but no, we have no final results to present to you. So I hope you bear this in mind, and we will more like to take this as an opportunity to discuss things with you as experts as Russian media scholars and so on, and expert in this area. So we can't promise you any final results, but more impressions of some themes that we have found in the material so far. But as Katarina said, this project is called Photographic Realism, and maybe you can start to share the PowerPoint, Ludmila. It's the project that Ludmila and I have. It's just the two of us. It's very convenient in that way. It is called Photographic Realism, and in the Photographic Realism in the digital media age. And it is funded by the Foundation for Baltic and East European Research at Södertörn University, and we will have money next year as well. So we will continue this project and focus on writing next year. This year we have been trying to collect material, which has been quite hard also because of the pandemic that is changing things in a real fundamental way when you're doing research and field work and so on. But if we move to the next slide, Ludmila, and I think you can press 3 times. Okay, thank you. As Katarina said, the focus is on programs for photojournalism and documentary photography in Russia and Sweden, and in Russia, it's focused on Moscow, really. It's the Faculty of Journalism at the Moscow State University and the Rodchenko School of Photography and Multimedia in Moscow. And in Sweden, we focus on the Nordic Photography School, the Biskop Arne. It's outside of Bålsta in Sweden. And the Mid University in Sundsvall. The Mid University has been a kind of problem because they had a program for photojournalists, but it has been put on ice, as we say in Sweden at least. So we don't know if they will start that program again, but they have also taken initiatives to start a master program in the photojournalism or visual communication together with schools or universities in Denmark and Norway. So we have interviewed people there as well. And why we chose educations for photographers was that we thought that because photography is changing, and we'll come back to that in so fundamental ways. So if we want to find out how the discourses are developing around photography, then photo schools could be an interesting site to investigate, because we thought that would be the place where discourses and future practices around photography are taking shape. But it will, yeah. So that was the main reason why we chose educational sites, and this comparison also between Russia and Sweden. We thought that they were quite kind of, because one reason is that both Ludmila and I have been involved in comparisons between Russia and Sweden before. So we tried to continue that research, and we have also found, and most Ludmila would say, that there are kind of interesting similarities, but also differences between these contexts. So we thought that both the similarities and differences could be interesting to dig in deeper when it comes to photography. They are kind of different national contexts when it comes to political, economical, and cultural context. And it's also a difference between how the ideal of objectivity, for instance, that you, Ludmila, have been writing about in journalism, how they approach the ideal of objectivity in Sweden and Russia. In Sweden, it's more this practice that you should show different perspectives and so on. But in Russia, it's more like objectivity is closer to a truthful depiction or depiction of reality, I would say. And in Russia, it would be possible maybe to say that it's a more passive journalism compared to Sweden, where you have a more autonomous journalistic field. But of course, this can be problematized in different ways. But that was a way that we entered this, that there are similarities, but also important differences between these national contexts. And it's also different visual cultures, we would say, and also when it comes to photographs in journalism and documentary photographs that you have in Russia. You had, during the Soviet times, a long tradition of reducing photographs to illustrations in journalism, and also a long history of censorship and manipulations. But also interesting parts when it comes to the avant-garde photography in the 1920s, for instance, and its revival during the 1960s and so on. And in Sweden, we have quite strong documentary tradition with Christer Strömholm, for instance. And it is a long tradition in Sweden with the documentary photography, and it has also influenced the photojournalism in Sweden as well. So we had some thoughts about why it would be interesting to compare these to national contexts. So maybe the next slide. Yes, just to say something about our expectations or prejudices, if you would like to say it, before when we entered this, or ideas about what have happened with photography during the last decades. And one such context that has been written a lot about is that amateur pictures you see an abundance of amateur photography on websites and social media and so on. And since the beginning of photography, it has been understood as a less demanding practice compared to for instance, painting or drawing. Everyone can take a good photo, but this has really been enhanced with the digital photography. And now you can take pictures in your mobile phone, and you can upload them and circulate your pictures with a speed that has not been witnessed before. And this has been highlighted in a number of studies as both a threat and an opportunity for professional journalists. A threat because now everyone can be a photojournalist. So it's a threat towards the occupation, so to speak. And an opportunity because of the possibilities to engage in dialogue with a visual dialogue with citizens, that citizens can contribute with their own views and pictures, and that could be used in journalism as well. And on this slide you see two examples of books written about this new condition with amateur pictures and how photojournalism relate to this new context. One is edited by Stuart Allen called Photojournalism and Citizen Journalism, which is a focus on this collaborative aspect of digital, that has come with digitalization, that citizens can contribute with their own pictures. And the other book is Amateur Images and Global News, written by Mary Panti and Karian Papadopoulos, which also emphasizes this new situation and how photojournalists can cope with this new situation. So this was one important context. And if you move to the next slide, Ludmila, another context was, of course, the easiness to manipulate and work with pictures because of the digitalization. Manipulation and post-production is not a new phenomena, but they're as old as photography, you can say. But with the move from analog to digital photography, manipulations has become more of a rule than an exception. So we can no longer take the indexicality with photography for granted. And this picture that you see on this slide is a picture from Kremlin at the 8th of March 2017, and it was published as a news about feminist activists, and they have put a banner on the Kremlin wall saying that men in power for 200 years out. But the next day it was revealed that this picture was in fact a montage. It was a manipulation. But it was spread as an actual picture on the 8th of March. So that is another important context that we thought that is interesting to because it problematized photographic realism. So that was one starting point as well, or one interest. Yes, and the next. You can also turn this around, that manipulation is not only a problem, it can also be an opportunity maybe. And this example that you see, it's two ice skaters. It's taken from Fred Ritchen. He's a professor at the Center of Photography in New York. And he used this as an example of a photo of something that never has happened, just like the banner on the Kremlin wall. These two ice skaters, they had never met on ice, but this picture was used in this magazine, New York Newsday, in a reportage about their infected rivalry. They have made a film, maybe you've seen it. It was released a couple of years ago, I, Tonya. It was about the rivalry between these two ice skaters. One of them attacked the other and so on, because she was not as good as the other, and she wanted to take the place in the American team. But according to Fred Ritchen, the professor in photography, he also sees this as an opportunity for photographers. If photos are understood as interpretations and constructions of reality and not parts of it, pictures can be used to show possible scenarios. And one, I couldn't find a good example of this, but one example that Fred Richens talked about is global warming, that you could actually show pictures of the consequences of global warming. That could be something that journalists and documentary photographers could use to really show people how it will affect our world. Another context that started to trigger us that when we entered this project was the opportunity with digital media to compare pictures and link to different resources and so on. This is an example by Tyrone Martinsson. He's a Swedish photographer, and he has worked with the documenting Svalbard, and he uses his own photographs and compare them with old photographs and drawings and maps and so on to understand the consequences of global warming on Svalbard. And this use of archive material or archive photos is a way to work with pictures that could be more common in the future, and that we thought that maybe this is something that they discussed in the educational programs, the opportunities with the databases on digital media that digital media has contributed with. Yes, Ludmila, the next one. And I think this was after we got the money, this project was launched. But it's interesting in a way because it has similarities with our ideas about a new situation that creates a space for the professional photographer. This was a project called Last Night in Sweden, made by documentary photographers in Sweden, as an answer to Trump's statement that look at what happened in Sweden last night, and nobody knew what happened in Sweden. He came up with something that his situation was terrible and there were violence in the streets and so on, but nobody know what he was talking about. And now some documentary photographers in Sweden, they crowdfunded this project to show what really how it looks in Sweden, an ordinary day in April, I think it was in 2018. So this is a kind of a professional answer to rumors and so on that are spread on social media. And this was also launched as the true story, Last Night in Sweden, the true story, not the fake one that Trump referred to. But in our understanding, it shows the need for trustworthy depictions of the reality. That was the idea with this project. It also ended up in a photo book that was sent to the Congress in the US as well. Yes, Ludmila, we can take another. Yeah, and also another context for this project is that the new technologies provide with new ways of seeing. And this example shows how Dagens Nyheter, the big daily in Sweden, have started to invest in new technologies such as virtual reality and 360 degrees pictures. And this is also something different from traditional journalism, and it also provides an opportunity for the professional photographers to work in new ways that we thought maybe this is something that they discuss in the educational programs. Yes, so to sum up these contexts that I have been sketching here is that it's possible to talk about the paradigmatic shift when it comes to photography, that photography is something else than it used to be. Some have started to talk about post-photography, and others talk about that, say that photography is a totally different medium. It has nothing to do with photography, the analog photography as we knew it. And digitalization has also opened for media convergence, that you integrate still pictures with moving pictures, sounds and text and so on. So it's thematized as a paradigmatic shift. And we were then interested in how can we understand this paradigmatic shift if we look at education for photojournalists and documentary photographers. How do they experience this shift? That was the entrance point for us with this project. Yes, And to say something then about photographic realism, it's the basic idea with photographic realism, how it was introduced once when photography was introduced in the 1840s. It is about the correspondence between a photograph and what the camera has been pointed at, between the photography, the correspondence between the photography and the external reality. And we are interested in how is this discussed and what practices are developed around this, how to make trustworthy depictions of reality today, if you take consideration of this, if it is this paradigmatic shift that a lot of scholars are talking about. How is that met in educations for photojournalism? And how do educations for photojournalists work with finding ways to engage and make their work relevant and meaningful in people's life, the kind of democratic value, you could say, and what kind of competences has become important, and how is then digital photography after this, if it is a paradigmatic shift, how is it used as a medium, and we understand then, of course, realism and objectivity as something that shifts. Realism is a cultural convention, and objectivity is a professional practice. It's nothing given and natural with this. And we are interested in this project in how these concepts, these really big and problematic concepts like realism, objectivity, truth, how are they filled with meaning in the different educational settings, context, and how are their relation, and how to understand that. That was what triggered us. Yes, Ludmila, and we started then to work with when we applied for this research project, we used visual literacy as a central concept. We started to talk about professional visual literacy and so on, but we have ended up with this concept instead, the concept of the photographic self. And one reason for this is a kind of cowardly reason, you could say, that when we talked about visual literacy, we got a lot of critique, and it seems like it could mean so many different things, and people have their own ideas about what visual literacy is, and it's really a minefield also, that people have their really strong opinions about what is visual literacy and what is not visual literacy. And it tends to, when you speak about visual literacy, it tends to focus more on the audience perspective than on the professional communicators. But even this new concept, then, the photographic self, can be misleading. If you, for instance, search on studies about photographic self on Google Scholar, for instance, then you end up with a lot of studies that uses photographs in identity formations, often done from a psychological perspective. And that is not really what we like to do in our project. We have instead been inspired by a book about scientific objectivity. And that book is written by Daston and Gallison, and it was published in 2010. It's a really good book, and I recommend it. It's called Objectivity, and it's really, really interesting. And it's about science and the development of science. But in that book, they discuss the concept, the scientific self. And they argue that image making and image reading became the core in science from the 19th century and onwards. And they say that science can be understood as kinds of sight or practices of seeing. And they are interested in atlas making, for instance, in biology and so on. And they state in the beginning of their book, and that's the quote you see on this slide, that one of the main messages of this book is that epistemology and ethos are intertwined. And we have tried to start thinking from their perspective when we are thinking about and discussing educations for photojournalists and documentary photographers, and how these educational contexts form ideas about photography as an occupation. And when Dustin and Gallison write about objectivity in science, they find that it raises questions about the relation between truth and beauty. It was common in the beginning, in the 19th century, that there were collaborations between scientists and artists when making atlases, for instance. And they find the relation between the perfect and the imperfect with the introduction of objectivity and with the help of photography as tool, for instance. Then the imperfect became kind of ideal to not show the perfect example of a leaf or something, but show the varieties and so on. And they also highlight the relation between the active and the passive scientist, the experimenter versus the observer. And we have thought about that in relation to photography as well, that you find the truth beauty is to highlight the photographer as an artist, and the perfect imperfect can be a way to relate to the mechanical dimension of photography, that the correspondence between what you point the camera at and what you see on the picture, ideas about realism, and the active passive dimension about the role of the photographer as an observer, close to the ideal of objectivity maybe, or as an experimenter or even an activist that you're trying to change things with photography. So this is where we are now, I would say. Maybe you would like to add something, Ludmila, but this is mainly the context for the project before we move on. Or would you like to add something maybe?
Thank you so much, Patrick. No, I think we can take questions if there are any.
Yes, we have one question from Michael Scholz. So speaking about manipulation, are there any rules about that for a professional photographer? I think in connection with the best picture of the year, manipulation should not be allowed, something like that.
Yeah. And it's also interesting that these kind of contests, picture of the year and so on, they set the standards for what you can do with a photo. So they are really important, and in both national context and at the different schools, they point at these contests that they are really important for what you can do and what you can't do. So it's kind of an international field that opens when you look at these different educational settings.
Like, I also thought about that nowadays one is tempted to consider himself or herself a photographer, because everyone who has a camera or at least a mobile phone can become a kind of photographer. And I wondered, what trends do these like unprofessional amateur photographers establish? How they influence professional, formally trained community?
A good question. I can't really say anything about it. Maybe you can a bit, Ludmila, but we haven't really looked at it. You could say that it could have popped up when we have talked to the students and educators and so on, and teachers, but it really have not, I think. Maybe you have a different opinion, Ludmila, or?
I think that both the students and the educators, they really emphasized this difference between being a professional photographer and an amateur photographer. So just like what we discuss in journalism versus citizen journalism or blogging, there are very specific ethical frameworks that one should work within. So in a way, like maybe amateur photography is freer because it has like all possible methods at use and all possible instruments. But then for professional photographers, it's much more limited, but then you need to think out of the box all the time because you have this ethical framework and you know what is allowed and what is not allowed. And they really highlighted it all the time in both of the contexts.
And how do they usually treat these unprofessional photographers? So are they arrogant, like I just wonder, or not?
Shall you continue, Ludmila?
Indeed.
Well, no, I don't think so. I mean, like most of the students, they were saying that they came to this program, maybe not because they desire to become a professional photographer, but because they have this drive to take photographs. So in a way, they all sort of started there as amateur photographers. So yeah, like you can't be sort of arrogant towards yourself in a way. But then, well, we'll speak more about it today, of course, in the presentation. But they spoke about how important it is to take a step further, how important it is to get education, because that gives you a different perspective, they said, and both in relation to what you learn when it comes to the history of art, history of photography, that you, as a professional photographer, you're not discovering a bicycle every time. So no, I wouldn't say that there is an arrogant perspective, but rather that we know something else that someone who has not taken a program does not know.
Thanks. So the discussion continues. Another comment from Michael Scholz. What I understand, you should have a lot in common with comic studies. About comics, journalism, or documentary comics, or visual literacy, correct? So comics studies.
We haven't talked about comic studies, but that surely could be interesting to look at. So that was a great comment. Visual literacy we have been dealing with a lot, as I mentioned also, and will continue to deal with. But comic studies we haven't really looked into, so maybe that's something that we should do. Yeah.
Okay, I think no more questions, so we can continue.
Yes, and maybe I could ask you to pause the recording then, because now I'll show you some pictures from our educational sites. I don't know, Patrick, if you have anything to add on our methods.
No, I think it was great. Thanks.
Well, I don't see any questions from the audience. Let me. Yeah, I think that we can continue.
Then we can continue and take the rest. So now to the preliminary findings. And as I said, we have several themes there, and one of them obviously is concerning the technological aspects. And the interesting thing is that both in Russia and in Sweden, the teachers, they spoke about how the focus of the education has significantly shifted from technology to the content, the meaning of photography. And also in relation to this digital turn, they said that, interestingly, what some of them referred to as archaic methods, like working in the darkroom with analog photography, these methods are still taught, both due to the interest of such alternative methods, especially when it comes to art forms from the side of the students, but also in order to teach the students the history of photography and a need for reflection, enabled by what also many of our informants refer to as slow methods of the past. And here you have two quotes from the teachers, and we intentionally took away the like what educational sites they represent if it's in Russia or in Sweden, because we found in fact many more similarities than differences there. So in the past you needed a year to master photography, but today 2 hours are enough for understanding and obtaining technical skills. And I think that's one of the things that we also teach our students. They must also know about the slow process of analog photography. So our school is really very much about that philosophy and not so much a technical school. Patrick?
Yes, and it's possible to say that you find almost the same kind of answers in the students material. I would say there's no big discrepancies between the teacher's perspective and the student's perspective, and it's possible to say that the imperfect picture is not an ideal if you think about the mechanical registration in analog photography. It's almost like because of the easiness, I would say, to take photos, the professional photographer in these settings are trained to see the world in a perfect way, so to speak. The easiness has become an obstacle that you have. Maybe that can be an answer also to the question we had before in relation to amateur pictures, that it's almost like an obstacle, the easiness that you have to handle. One example that was given is that you should force yourself just to take one picture. You have the opportunity to take as many pictures as you can in a digital camera, but you should force yourself just to take one picture, because this limits you, and this really make you you have to think about how you should look at the world. So you're really trained in this specific way of seeing, and that is the way they think about technology. I would say that you should tame the technology, and it should be a tool to make you see better. And we would say that it's surprising, if you compare to what we said in the beginning with the context, it's surprising that technology plays such a subordinate role in the educational setting, that seeing is the primary skill, not to handle the technology in a way to build websites where you can interact with the amateur user, visual providers and so on. So it's really, it's more like the answer you saw in the last night in Sweden, that the answer to a paradigmatic shift is in a way that you should teach how to see in a more perfect, in a better way. The artistic way of seeing is what is taught in the schools. And there are no big difference between the Russian and Swedish material. One small tendency is that the internet is seen is seen as a threat in the Russian material, a threat that makes it impossible to earn your living on documentary photography and photojournalism, that everything should be for free, and that they are not respecting copyright issues and so on. And you don't find that so often in the Swedish material, I would say. Or would you agree, Ludmila?
Well, yes, yet all in all, this aspect of entrepreneurship was really in focus in both what our Russian and Swedish informants talked about. So all in all, there is this pessimism both in Sweden, a little less though, and Russia related to the current market structure and development of media market, all in all, and the place for documentary photography in it. There is an expectation that students will live on commercial photography in future and create documentary photography for free, or in the best case for museums and galleries that today often can pay more than established traditional media. And that's a really interesting turn, we thought, more towards like art platforms rather than traditional platforms where documentary photography is sort of something expected. As a future photographer, one of the informants said, you must learn how to promote yourself, to communicate professionally, to promote your personal projects or a particular brand if you are working with one. A photographer has become an economist in a way. And it's a little paradoxical, I think, because in the Nordic context, although there is more trust in traditional media, and that there is still some interest in traditional media to open new jobs for visual journalists, there is more focus in education on preparing people ready for freelance and to be an entrepreneur. One of the Swedish informant said, a request for photojournalists as a professional community has decreased drastically. Yet during the last months, we have actually seen how JP has employed 3 new photojournalists. DN has employed a photo editor and a photojournalist. It is very clear how the new professional role looks like and what competences, what qualifications they search for. They speak about a visual communicator. Patrick?
And in a way, it's possible to say that the situation is not quite, it's not new, because when documentary photography and photojournalism entered newspapers and magazines in the 20s and 30s in Sweden, for instance, then it was in Germany and so on, it was common to combine work in different photographic fields, such as art, advertising, and journalism. So in that respect, the situation today is kind of similar with the situation 100 years ago, maybe. And maybe it's not a bad thing. It opens also for creativity and reflexivity, that you don't just work with one thing. But as Ludmila mentioned, this branding aspect is maybe something that has become more important, and it's also taking over other aspects, as for instance, having a political agenda, being an activist and so on. It's not what is emphasized in the material. It's more of that you should brand yourself to become successful in these different photographic fields. And as Ludmila said, it's the artistic ambitions that are emphasized, that the students want to work with documentary photo, and they're dreaming about making photo books and so on. They're really dreaming of old media contexts. And working with other kind of photography is a way to finance these more traditional artistic projects, I would say.
And the third theme, obviously, was photographic realism, also related to what kind of questions we asked in the interviews. And there we could see some interesting things. For example, this discussion about the role of an author in documentary photography. And most of the informants, they spoke about the importance of the author's self-reflexive framing of the event and heroes, some kind of role of a photographer publicist, if one compares it to written journalism. But there also were radical views among our informants, like believing in automation of photography, that the digital camera sort of neglects this subjectivity of an author, and it frees photography from the author's subjectivity completely. Also, interestingly, they spoke about the transformation of the public, the critical and ever-checking eye of the public. So some of the quotations here you can see, we teach very firmly that photojournalism is not an objective practice, it is a subjective practice, as all storytelling is. I think that the internet is somehow both our friend and our enemy. It's our friend because you can't cheat, like there is always someone on the internet checking up on you, and then it's also our enemy because there are so many, everybody questions everything.
So, but the tendency, we would say, wouldn't we, that it is that the subjective dimension is emphasized in the material. But in relation to this photographic realism question, it's also underlined that you are not allowed to change anything in a photo if you are going to publish it in a journalistic context, except for what you could do, as Ludmila mentioned earlier, except for what you could do in the darkroom. And then with darkroom, they mean it becomes a kind of metaphor for that you can work with light and so on. You shouldn't do manipulations in the photographs. And as I mentioned earlier, that the contests are setting standards for what you can do with a photograph. They demand, for instance, raw files, and that is something that a lot of newspapers have started to demand as well. And it's something that they stress in this material also. But photography, if I could say something more, are we in a hurry? Maybe. Or it's not about the frozen moment, you could say, when it comes to this photographic realism. It's more about storytelling. It's just like written journalism, you could say. And that you should need to understand what you are documenting. That as there is no true story, you should understand what you're doing. Who is it you are photographing? What kind of topic are you covering? But the photographer should express his voice or I through the photos. But it is a small tendency, if we compare the Swedish and Russian context, there is a small tendency that the Russian informants, especially the teachers, I would say, are more pronounced about the danger with manipulation and post-production than the Swedish informants. So it's more, yes, it's more talk about the dangers in the Russian material. Yes, Linda?
Yes, then dialogue we felt was like a crucial concept and metaphor, I would say, because the teachers and the students, they spoke about the importance of communication and dialogue, both within the educational program and also beyond. So how one should learn how to establish dialogue with the one being photographed, between each other, with employers, with the public. So this is seen as one of the most important skills that is trained in a dialogue in education for dialogue in photography. If we see photography as meeting between people. And this includes also a focus on analysis of others and own photos, which is an important part of education both in Russia and Sweden. And this dialogue can also be seen a little broader as transparency in photographic methods, because they speak a lot about how the public needs to become aware about the context in which the image was taken and how it was taken, and also, as Patrick already mentioned, concerning the ethics for professional documentary photographers. So here you also see some quotations about how they work with different kinds of assignments. And they say, we'll look at how a photograph is constructed, main trends and main languages. Photography is a conversation about languages.
But it's also a dialogue from the communicator's perspective, really, as you said, Ludmila. It's not. It's also, if you go back to this technology issue, then we thought that maybe you should use the new technology in ways to interact with audience and media users in new ways. But it isn't really the case. Here, dialogue is more about in the educational setting, for instance, talk about the pictures, what you see in the pictures, and what you could have done different, and so on. And in Swedish context, it's not so much talk about ethical aspects. And some students also say it should be more talk about ethics in our education. But that is not the case if we look at Moscow State University, for instance. They speak a lot about ethical issues, both students and teachers. It seems to be a continuing dialogue around that thing. And but if you compare them to the material from Rodchenko, then it's quite different, because maybe of their orientation towards art. Here's the dialogue, I would say, is more about building connections in the art world, and dialogue between different genres and different media, sculpture, photography, and painting, and so on, how to integrate them and how can they talk to each other. It's also, didn't hear if you mentioned that, Ludmila, but it's also more hierarchical relation, I think, between the student and the teacher at Rodchenka. It's a kind of, than at the other, both at Moscow State University and in the Swedish Biskopsgården. It's more like that you're really interested in this master and you follow this master's classes and so on. And that's a kind of different kind of dialogue that you're really looking up to someone that are going to teach you how to conduct photography, develop your eyes, trained artistic eyes and so on.
Exactly. And now our fifth and last theme, which we think also works as some kind of umbrella in a way for everything we have said already. That is where we are thinking in terms of whether we can see some kind of reprofessionalization going on, both in the field of documentary photography and photojournalism as such, and if we talk about educational sites where students are socialized into being documentary photographers or photojournalists. So basically what we could see is that all schools, they speak about how they need to prepare photographers for both fields, journalism and art, how they rather choose to speak about visual communicators or visual storytellers in a very broad sense in the making, rather than speaking just about photojournalism or just about documentary photography. Yet this is perceived in a somewhat ambivalent way because art aspect in documentary photography is wanted, even if it is always endangered by the documentary aspect. But it is also seen as dangerous, as one of the informants said, if everyone will be an artist, I'm worried for the professional photographers. They also speak about some kind of visual turn, all in all, that has made visual journalism and documentary photography education equal to written journalism, raised its status. And we can see how both at Moscow State University and also at Mid-Sweden University, there is now this wish and steps made in order to start master programs in photojournalism or visual communication. So there is a focus on the skills needed for working on and for different platforms and in multiple genres, from gallery exhibitions to social media. And in Russia, interestingly, despite prevailing mistrust in traditional media, there is a discussion of the importance of training in working in editorial framework for future photographers. Also in Russia, there is very much focus on this general cultivation, high expectations concerning professional visual literacy, knowledge of history of art and photography, so that they do not invent a bicycle, as I said, and orientation in social, economic, political, and cultural agenda of the day.
And it's really interesting, wouldn't you say that also, Ludmila, that they have taken really different ways to answer this kind of the new situation for photojournalists and documentary photographers in this kind of reprofessionalization. At MSU, as you said, they have really embraced this multi-skilled ideal of that the journalists should do very different things. They should both be able to write, take pictures, and film, do their own films and so on. And but at the same time, they are quite skeptical about the future for photojournalism in that context. But at Biskopsgården in Sweden, they have chosen another way, as you mentioned, Ludmila. They have broadened education, that they don't call it photojournalism any longer. They call it, what's the name? What I just slipped now. It's just,
isn't it
professional photography? I think it's just the program for professional photography. It used to be a program for photojournalism. So they have chosen this way to broaden it, to that preparing the students to become freelancers. And at Rodchenka, they have chosen a third way. They have turned to art and mixing photography with other visual media. So an abandoned realism in a way, you could say. And as you mentioned, Ludmila,
not only visual media, like this combination of sound and photography. This is also that is
yeah.
And
as you mentioned,
I'm wondering how are we doing in terms of time, because now it's been an should we wrap up?
Yes, probably. But I think that it's almost the end of your presentation.
Yeah, we will just go then, Patrick, if you don't mind, and I'm just going to the very last slide so that you knyter ihop den här.
Okay, is it me already?
Yes.
Okay, I'll see if I. Yes, we tried to. Thought that we should try to come back to what we said in the beginning, the theoretical frame that we mentioned, to return to that, and how we can fill the different concepts with meaning, with departure from our material, the truth, realism, and objectivity. This really broad interest that we have, complicated interest in several ways. But if we, with departure from what Ludmila said from the material, if we talk about the truth-duty dimension, then it's possible to say that what is emphasized, what is becoming ideal in these different settings, is the trained artistic eye. And it's also the individual photographer. It's not really a collective or collaborative work. It's really the individual artist that is emphasized. That you should develop your individual artistic eye. That's the goal from both the teachers and the students. And if we talk about perfect and imperfect, which can be related to realism, the realism dimension, then the analog photos, the mechanical registration with analog photos open for imperfections as a way to enhance realism. But that is not an ideal in this material that we have looked at. In both national contexts, they stress that you shouldn't alter a journalistic picture, but it's the darkroom principle that we mentioned earlier. That metaphor that is becoming the salient perspective in the material. You should do something with the material. You have to do something because of the digital. It's digital from the beginning, but you shouldn't do more than we used to do with the darkroom. So that's a historical dimension that still lingers on. And if we look at the active-passive dimension, which can be related to the ideal of objectivity, then the photographer is understood as demanding. The role of the photographer is understood as very different depending on which field or context you work in. In journalism, the role should be more passive. In documentary photography, you should be you can be more active. In advertising and art, you should develop a certain style and so on. But the informants do not express new ways of seeing, really, and interacting, as we've said before, with media users in relation to the paradigmatic shift that we mentioned in the beginning. But one common theme in the material is to emphasize the storytelling dimension, that there is no, as Ludmila said, there is no fundamental difference between writing journalist and photojournalism. They just use different tools. That is the situation today, and that they like to speak for both students and the teachers. And storytelling is also understood as the opposite to today's, what they expressed as a fragmentation of pictures, that you meet pictures in endless flows on social websites and on newspapers' websites and so on. But storytelling is something different, that you get a whole, a story of something. And that's what they like to work with. And these different ideals, the trained artistic eye, the darkroom norm, the storytelling ideal, can be, it's more easy to use them in certain contexts than others. And in Sweden, it seems like it's still possible to use them in traditional journalism. They often mention traditional journalism as a future workplace, and they mention photojournalists as role models and so on. But it's not really the same case in Russia. At Rodchenka, they have moved in another direction. You could say they have skipped this the realism ideal, but they are still talking about the trained artistic eye and storytelling and so on. And at Moscow State University, it's possible to say that they have no high trust in the traditional media field, but they are working with setting the standards to change the ideals concerning photojournalism. So they have this kind of project almost going on at Moscow State University. They want to change how it is in journalism. But it's not hard to practice these ideals when it comes to photography in traditional journalism in Russia today. That was what you could say from the departure from our material. Yes, maybe I am there. I have some questions to you as well, but we can take them further on maybe.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And I'm just showing our email addresses, and then I'm stopping to share this presentation, and we are looking forward to your questions and reflections.
Thank you very much for such a marvelous presentation. And I would dare to ask the first question. I just remember when I was a student and I studied journalism like a lot of years ago. And we also had these photography classes where mostly we were taught how to develop analog photographs. And what I remember is that those old teachers, they were just complaining that, well, all these digital photos, they are not true. Analog photograph is the best. So my impression was that, at least in that context, university was not the best place to capture these photographic practices of the future, that it was like conserving these old practices. So what do you feel after conducting this research? Like, are schools the places where these future practices are forged or not? What do you think? What do you feel?
That's an interesting question, really. We have been struggling with that. And I think we also got that question at the beginning when we didn't receive any money for this project. That is it really the place to look at? And maybe it's not. But anyway. It is important to look at that context because that's where the future photographers are educated. So where should we look if we wouldn't look there? But it's also, at the same time, it's also interesting to see that it is kind of conservative. I wouldn't say that they have kind of that the ideal among the teachers are the analog photography. I wouldn't say that. It's more that we like we mentioned in the presentation, that it's more like taming the technology, to use it to your own advantage, to develop your artistic visuals, the artistic eyes, the professional eyes, that you can see better. But it's kind of conservative if you think about projects that we mentioned in the beginning and that we have read about and so on, that you could use. You can use websites to interact. The different groups could interact with their visual storytelling and so on. They don't have this kind of, either in Sweden or Russia, didn't have these kind of ideas. So it's conservative in that way. But I wouldn't say that it's more like, you could also say that it's like that digital photography has freed photography from the burden of this mechanical representation. Now you can use photography as a tool in the same way as written journalists, for instance. You can tell your stories with the help of this tool. So it's in that way, maybe it's not that conservative. So it's complex, I would say. but what would you say, Ludmila?
Well, Katya and me, we were studying at the same time and in similar contexts. So we were also working with very old and black and white analog photography, just because there was not really well, the technological equipment that we could use at that moment, although digital cameras already existed. But I think that, like Patrick said, maybe due to the time, there is not that much space for experiments that the students can do. But as we said, everyone emphasized, both the students and the teachers, that the basics of technology, you can actually search for yourself. Like you can do that on YouTube in 2 hours and learn how to use the camera or how to use Photoshop and so on and so forth. But you need to learn some other things that only can be provided to you in some kind of structured manner at these educational sites, like history of art, for instance. And also the connections, because everyone emphasized that we are here to learn about who are the main people in the field and to get these connections.
Thank you. And I think that Leo has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this very fascinating topic you are working with. I wish you good luck. I have always also been worked in a dark room. It's a long time ago, so nothing about it. But it's also a very difficult topic, for me at least, to understand. And maybe some concepts, if you could clarify a little bit this realism you are using, because and how do they use it in Russia? Because there was this socialist realism and is there some track from socialist realism to how they understand realism today, or is it just something quite different, and is it just comparable with realism in our among our photographs or our artists, maybe also that how one understands realism? Is it the kind of, is it own concept in photography, or is it something similar as in the arts in general? Or maybe you can clarify a little bit.
Mm. Yes, it is tricky. And I had some had some questions to you as well about this, the Soviet realism and so on, and how to use that in understanding our findings. Maybe we can come back to that, but we haven't, when we interviewed students and teachers, we haven't talked about, we haven't asked them about realism. We have talked about it in other ways, so to speak, how to depict reality in a trustworthy way and so on. I can't remember really exact the words we used, but we haven't tried to, we haven't had predefined definitions of the concepts when we have started to work with it, but thought about it when the themes that we have presented today is when we have, it's a kind of combination between the theoretical frame that we have taken departure from and what we have found in the material, and see how realism can be understood with departure from the material in a way. But if we have one kind of starting point when it comes to realism, it is this what has been called photographic realism by some scholars. And as I said before, it's that correspondence between the external reality and what you see in the picture. It seems to be almost convincing that you have this kind of relation with analog photography. and how that thought is kind of coming back and are emphasized in our material, and it is in a way then, and it's really similar between the contexts. They have kind of strong opinions, I would say, in both the Russian and Swedish context when it comes to what you can do in journalism. And then I think you could say that it's the international field that frames realism in a way when it comes to journalism, what you are allowed to do with a photograph and what you're not allowed to do. So it's really to take it from, it's kind of inductive way to understand realism. How do they speak about this? If they thematize the correspondence between external reality and a picture in some ways, how do they do that? And how can we think about it? But we need to think more about it, but we have no predefined definitions of the concept. That's what's the way to work with this material.
It's more like reflecting reality, realism. In
Yes,
socialist realism, I think there was the story that the proletariat is making revolution and making the better, and realism had some task related to this.
Yeah.
And I think in Swedish there was not this kind of task, but maybe there were other stories which realism wanted to tell. But okay, thank you.
Okay, Caroline wanted to ask the question next. Can you unmute yourself?
Now I can. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I wanted to push back a little bit on the idea that there is a need still for structured education, because we're not only in a post-truth world, we're in a world where we're seeing kind of the death of the expert, so to speak, in a lot of fields. And I think if we look at digital media, oftentimes that's releasing people from the need to have formal training, and also even things like building a portfolio. This can be easily done online at this point. So for example, if we look at, one of the best pages in terms of photography now is the live journal feed of Ilya Varlamov, who, as far as I know, is not a photographer at all by training or profession. He's an architect. And yet he does a really good job including just showing the reality of what life is like in Russia today. So I wanted to kind of push a little bit more on whether formal training is really necessary at this point. And also along the lines of formal training, oftentimes formal training is necessary, but it's because of the connections that one makes during the educational processes and the networking. And in Russia, we know that, for example, connections are extremely important in the pre-admissions process even. It's the work that gets done before you get admitted to higher education, because once you get admitted to higher education, basically you're home free. You'll definitely find something afterwards because you've entered the elite, basically, in that way. In Sweden, oftentimes it doesn't even matter what amount of training you have. It's the connections you have even outside of your profession and outside of work, just connections that your family has that could get you a ministerial job, or could get you a job, at the municipal housing corporation or something like that. We're seeing more and more examples in Sweden of these types of cronyism going on. And so I wanted to see what you're seeing within this field, both in Russia and in Sweden.
Maybe Lumila, should you take?
Thank you so much for this question. Yes, in terms of this last part of your question, I think there is definitely this pessimism that we could see, especially in the students, in relation to what kind of future is expecting them. So in this sense, like, they spoke about these connections, but on the other hand, they sort of understood that the program as such and the connections they make during this program, they are not really providing them this safety net. So yeah, they were very critical in relation to this as well, although they hoped for this, what we could see. But then I think, I don't know, Patrick, maybe you correct me, and especially in the case of Rodchenko, where they really built on this very old-fashioned, and they're very open about this too, and self-reflexive. So they built on this very old-fashioned model where you learn from a master with a big M, and there is still very much trust, we would say, that we could see, especially in this documentary photography educational programs, that you choose your master and then you follow what he, and in most cases these are male teachers, so what he is telling you, so you're following this track, and then well, then later on it's up to you if you want to do something different.
Mm. But as you said, Ludmila, it's something that the reason they start these educations is to build a network. That it's an important reason why to start these kind of educations. That and educating their ways of seeing, to train their artistic eye, I would say. And when it comes to is it necessary to formal training, it's a lot of our I would say yes, and a lot of the informants are especially, of course, the teachers. And also I'm thinking about this program, Ludmila, the new Nordic Master program that they were planning. Those involved in that program said it was kind of convincing for me that if you go to journalists, for instance, a lot of writing journalists are doing visuals and taking photos now, and it's kind of devaluating journalism, and something must be done. And they see a great future for people with trained eyes to move into the journalistic field. And I think that is really important. If you should have a good democratic communication in a society, it's not just the skills to write, it's also the skill to take pictures that must be important. So I'm kind of convinced that it is necessary, but you don't have to go to formal training. But I think it should be. It's kind of problematic that you have so many educational sites for writing, but not for visuals. And it's worse in Sweden than it is in Russia as well.
I think Alexandra also wanted to ask a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Thank you very much, Ludmila and Patrick, for a very interesting project and presentation. I have a question regarding one of the things you mentioned about your preliminary results. So you mentioned that there is a shift from technology towards content. Have you noticed any particular representation of identities when they're teaching this content, or is there focus on any like national identity, gender, ethnicity, and so on? Do you think this is major for your project, or do you think you would mention it? And my second question is, have you considered interviewing other like photography private classes, or like evening schools that people can possibly go aside of their work, like not in the university per se, but maybe like some more private practice or something like that?
Ludmila, maybe?
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for this question. It's exciting because last week we were presenting some part of this at a conference in St. Petersburg online also, and that was exactly the same question. So now we feel that maybe we should pay a little more attention to our material in relation to exactly this. I would say that this is definitely a part of the ethical rules discussion. That they have, like what we should pay attention to when it comes to gender, ethnicity, age, and so on. But I think primarily this is about how the one being photographed needs to sort of communicate how he or she wants to be identified or be portrayed, and that the photographer needs to be very, very careful and listening, even to like non-spoken words about how the person wants to be portrayed or identified, and to be very careful about that. But now I definitely feel, Patrick, we should look more into what they were saying about it and how explicit they were about these aspects. You want to answer about the second part about the evening courses, or
maybe you could do that as well, because you have been attending some classes.
Yeah, well, I mean, these programs that, like, we look primarily at full-time programs, but of course all of these educational sites, they also offer shorter courses, evening courses. Also, one of these programs that we looked at, which is a one-year program at Moscow State University. This is it's done so that the students can actually go there after their work, because this is specifically for people who already have a high education and who already have another job. So yes, all of these educational sites they provide. And apart from this, we can see that in Russia there is a boom of photography schools for all age groups. And I can even mention that my mom, who has just become a pensioner in Russia, she's now doing online courses for free to learn some mobile photography, which is done in like very professional way with lectures and so on.
That's so nice. Thank you.
As we started to talk about ethics a bit, like I want to deliberate on this topic. It was interesting that you mentioned that in Sweden they pay a bit less attention to ethical issues than in Russia. Can you tell a bit more about it? And specifically, I'm interested, I don't know, on some conventions, agreements in this professional community about what we do not photo. Like, of course, it's not about censorship, but probably some self-regulations, self-restrictions. What is not for taking photos?
Do you remember something more, Ludmila? I'm not sure how much they speak about this in the Swedish context.
I think the discussions are primarily about post-production, so how much the pictures can be modified afterwards. And as Patrick said, that's more or less like what was allowed in the darkroom is still allowed today. And as it has been also said, the contests, they framed this, but they were also quite specific about like kids, how much attention you should play, how much attention you should draw to ethics when it comes to taking pictures of underaged, of in the conflict zones. It's a separate discussion of what you can do. Also today, of course, due to this situation, like in the hospitals, people that are like if something happened, also like wounded, yeah, and so on and so forth. But I think that this is some kind of universal convention. So in this sense, it's I wouldn't say that our informants in Russia and Sweden would say very different things about that.
They say more. They are more explicit about it in the Russian material than in the Swedish, I would say. But it's also about in relation to the other question about identities. It's also to be honest towards the one that you are photographing. Of course, that is something that they talk about in both national contexts.
Yeah, and also about transparency of your methods, like in what context the picture was taken, that it should always be provided to the public, that they should know, and also like if the picture was modified in any way.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Could I ask you some questions if you don't have any? Because it's in relation to Leo's question also about the realism, history of realism in the Russian context, and you're such experts in these areas. It would be interesting to hear, because we have been it's not so much written about it, but we have found some interesting scholarly work about realism in the Soviet context, and one is written by Jessica Varneke. I don't know who she is really. She writes about Soviet photography from the 20s to the 60s, and she says that photography's indexicality is not questioned, and that this understanding of photography also led to that photography could not be understood as art. Journalism was an area where photography could be practiced. That was the area, really. And this is a quote from her: "If an individual wished to pursue photography in higher education and become a photojournalist, the only option was to enter journalism department of their university or institute." So in that, I was kind of interesting in that context. Where is Rodchenka really radical educational setting? Maybe you have spoken about this a bit, Ludmila, with me before, but it would be interesting to hear if you have any thoughts about this. How radical is this photo school at Rodchenka when they also their move from, because they started as a school for photojournalists, but have now moved more to the artistic or art perspective of photography. Is this something that is extremely new in a Russian context, or do you find any similarities earlier in history? Yeah, that was something I was curious about. Maybe it was a hard question to answer. I can take another one at the same time. It's also about visual culture. Victoria Musvik has written about visual cultures, and in a book by Jens Elkins comparing visual cultures. And she says that Russia as a country can be described as a country where visual is subordinated to the verbal. It understands itself as a verbal country, and thereby is no need for visual literacy. And where paradoxically ubiquitous visuals are used to support those in power. And she calls it the Russian context. She calls they have fostered an attentive observer, which is specific to Russia. So it's a kind of skepticism towards the visual and photography and in general in the Russian context. Is that something that you recognize as well?
Well, may I? Maybe I'm not muted. But okay, I am not art historian. I really cannot feel that I know this branch but I can think this is just hypothetical thinking that maybe this socialist realism put more like hinders what you are not allowed to do than what you can do, and it was used in different political purposes. And then I can really think that maybe photography was not an art, and you can check it, but there was not a lot of what was not really allowed, like there was not sociology teaching in the universities. There was a kind of very narrow kind of sociology, but so there was a lot one couldn't do because of principles of this Soviet principles. So I guess you can certainly check this. I think it's useful to do it, and then to understand the role of this photograph schooling education today. So really, yeah. Okay.
Mm.
But I'm thinking that when you compare to Sweden, that what was it Swedish photographer trying to tell when it was realist photograph? Was it combined with the welfare state building?
Mm.
I guess you can find a lot of pictures, photographs related to building new shopping centers or physical training in the nature, people, and this kind of good things which in society. So maybe there is something as a historical background, but today's situation is different. And perhaps a kind of abstract art, which I suppose was not supported by socialist realism in art. So probably in photograph it was not neither something which was found very good thing. But I don't know. I'm sorry.
So there is last opportunity to ask a question.
Well, but may I just, this is maybe not related to this, it's a long history, but I was in Austria working one summer, and then I was told by, it was in a factory, and I was told by a worker there, because this was the part of Austria which was occupied by, after Second World War by Russians. The other parts were occupied by Westerners. And they told when the Russians came to this factory and this town, they had a lot of cameras with them. All the soldiers, I understood, had on camera, and that they brought, in a way, photographing to Austria, to this part of Austria. So in Soviet, photographing was really popular, and maybe the war was a special case that they wanted to take photographs of this war history. But okay, so I just think it's in Soviet is really, or Russia is really interesting because they have strong history in photography.
Yes, it's also, I've read an interesting article by Leah Dickerman. I don't know if you know who she is, but she has written about the retouched photography in the Soviet 1920s, where they visually show that the photograph is manipulated and retouched. That shows a kind of ambivalence towards the indexicality with photography. They both want to use it, and it's both and also a threat that photo can show wrong things, so to say. So it's really an interesting relation to the medium.
Okay, then I'm looking once more if there are any questions. So it's 5 minutes to 5. And what I can say is like huge thank you for this marvelous presentation. It was really, really interesting. and at least it let me think about the things that I never think just on my own. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming to IRES, and thank you for joining this webinar.
Thank you so much. We are so happy to be invited and to meet you. And the questions were really thought-provoking. I took some notes, and hopefully we will also maybe also could get the recording so that we can continue thinking and writing. Thank you so much.
Yes, thanks a lot, really.